This is the lecture on chapter 3, which is about genetics. So let's look at the next slide now. I included this quote just because I really like it and I think it says a lot about genetics and why it's important. The study of human heredity occupies a central position in genetics. Much of this interest stems from a basic desire to know who humans are and why they are as they are. We all would love to know why we behave as we behave, why we think the way we think, and genetics is important to study for that reason. When we think of genetics, we often think about natural selection, how we evolved through natural selection. And of course, Charles Darwin is the one that came up with this concept. Natural selection is organisms that are better suited for their environment will survive and reproduce, while those that are poorly suited for their environment will die off. Darwin's idea was that the goal of all of us, of all organisms, is to continue to survive and therefore be able to reproduce. So he contended that those who are more adapted to their environment, better suited for their environment, obviously are going to live longer and therefore be able to reproduce. And those that are not so suited to their environment are going to die off and therefore not be able to reproduce or not be able to reproduce as much. So how is natural selection related to genetics? Well, genetic variation, or the difference between individuals, is what contributes to a species' adaptation to its environment. He thought that your genetics could be your physical characteristics, your behavior, your temperament. All those things are going to affect how you adapt, which ultimately affects your longevity of life and how much you're able to reproduce. Just some terms to know related to genetics: genotype versus phenotype. Genotype is a person's unique sequence of DNA. We know that everyone's genotype is different. We all have unique DNA. Phenotype, however, is the observable expression of this genotype. For example, your hair color, your eye color, your height, those are all things that are produced by your genetics, but they're observable. We can see those differences. It is worth noting that phenotype can be influenced by both genetics and environment. Genotype is only influenced by genetics. And we'll look at that a little bit later in the slides, how genotype and phenotype work together, genetics and environment. So if you look at the diagram on the right, again, it just states genotype is the genetic makeup of an organism, the specific combination of genes that you inherit from your parents, which we know is all unique. The phenotype, you can see, again, is the observable traits, which result from the interaction between its genotype and the environment. Some other terms to know when looking at genetics are dominant versus recessive genes. If you look at the diagram next to that, let's look at the example of eye color. Brown in this example would be considered the dominant gene. Blue would be considered the recessive gene. So if you have two dominant genes, two brown eyes, the organism offshoot would have brown eyes. If you have two blue eyes, that's two recessive genes, it's going to be blue. One brown eye, one blue eye, you have a dominant and recessive gene. The dominant gene is going to take over, and so eye color would be brown. So there's a difference between dominant and versus recessive genes. Another term to know is a gene mutation. A genetic mutation is a change to a gene's DNA sequence to produce something different. It creates a permanent change to that gene's DNA sequence. Genetic variations are important for humans to evolve, which is the process of change over generations. A sporadic genetic mutation occurs in one person. So one person has this change in their DNA sequence, and it creates a change from then on in their offspring. This change could affect them. There are harmful mutations. Hemophilia would be an example, which is a blood loss disorder. There are neutral mutations, which would be eye color, hair color. We know those things are a product of genetics, but they're neutral. It doesn't really matter what your eye color is. So as I mentioned earlier, under phenotype, That is a result of the interaction between genes and the environment. So let's look a little bit further at this. The range of reaction asserts that our genes set the boundaries within which we can operate, and our environment interacts with the genes to determine where in that range we will fall. Our genes influence our environment, and our environment influences the expression of our genes. So they affect each other. Our genes can influence, again, our environment, and then our environment influences the expression of our genes. For example, if you have someone who's born perhaps with a genetic tendency to be depressed, their environment might contribute to whether that depression becomes active or not. If they live in a very negative environment or an abusive environment, that depression may, in a sense, be activated. If they live in a very supportive environment, that depression may just kind of remain unactivated and not come out. So that's an example of one interaction between genes and your environment. In closing, it is worth noting that genes affect more than their physical characteristics, which I think the example I just gave indicated that, but genes are also associated with our temperament and a number of psychological disorders, such as depression and schizophrenia. So when you think about your genes, remember it's more than your eye color and your hair color and your height. Psychologists' main interest is how it affects things like your personality. How does it affect your temperament? How does it affect your level of depression? That's what psychology focuses more on. And how do those mutations affect those things and affect your ability to survive in your environment? So that's all I have about genetics. Let me know if you have any questions as always, and thank you for listening.